The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly as Rose Cavanaugh clutched her younger sister Charlotte's hand with a grip so tight her knuckles turned white. The sisters stood on a crude wooden platform in Ash Fork, their wrists bound with coarse rope, their once fine dresses now tattered and soiled from weeks of travel. It was 1876, and the West was still wild and unforgiving, especially for two young women whose father had gambled away their inheritance, their home, and finally, their freedom. Next up, two fine specimens from back east, bellowed Lester Donovan, the slave trader who had acquired the sisters through a shady debt collection. His voice carried across the dusty town square where a crowd of rough-looking men had gathered. Educated, can read and write, cook and clean. The older one's 22, younger's 19. Good breeding stock. I'm selling them as a pair, starting bid $50. Rose, her auburn hair falling in tangled waves down her back, raised her chin defiantly. At 22, she had promised their dying mother she would always protect Charlotte. The younger Cavanaugh sister trembled beside her, tears streaming down her dirt-smudged face, her blonde curls limp in the heat. $60. Shouted a portly man near the front, his eyes roving over Charlotte's form with undisguised lust. $75, called another, a silver-toothed miner with hands like leather. The bidding escalated quickly, the figures climbing as men assessed the sisters like cattle at market. Rose fought back bile as she heard crude comments about their figures, their potential usefulness in brothels, or, as frontier wives, it made little difference to these men. 120. The voice that cut through the crowd was different, deeper, calmer, carrying an authority that silenced the rabble momentarily. The crowd parted, revealing a tall figure striding toward the auction platform. Dust swirled around his boots as he walked, the spurs jingling with each purposeful step. His face was partially obscured by the brim of a black Stetson, but Rose could see a strong jawline dusted with stubble and eyes the color of a storm-tossed sea. $120 for the pair, the stranger repeated, reaching the front of the crowd. He pushed his hat back slightly, revealing a face weathered by sun and wind, yet not unkind. He couldn't have been more than 30, with broad shoulders and a lean frame that spoke of a life spent in the saddle. 150, countered the silver-toothed miner. The stranger's hand moved slightly, revealing the worn handle of a Colt revolver at his hip. 200, he said quietly, but his voice carried across the suddenly hushed square. Donovan's greedy eyes lit up. 200 going once. 250, shouted a voice from the back. 300, countered the stranger without hesitation. The crowd murmured. It was an exorbitant sum for two women, even educated ones. 300 going once, going twice. Donovan paused dramatically, scanning the crowd for any higher bidders. Finding none, he slammed his hand down on a wooden crate. Sold, to the gentleman in the black hat. Charlotte let out a small sob, and Rose squeezed her hand, trying to convey courage she didn't feel. They had just been sold to a complete stranger, and whatever fate awaited them couldn't possibly be good. The stranger approached the platform, pulling a leather pouch from his vest pocket. He counted out the money methodically, handing it to Donovan before turning his attention to the sisters. "Name's Rylan Xavier," he said, his voice low as he reached for the ropes binding their wrists. "Ranch owner from outside town. If you think we'll willingly become your—" Rose began, her voice shaking with fury and fear. "You won't become anything you don't want to be, madam," Rylan interrupted, deftly untying the knots. "I heard them talking about separating you two at the saloon last night. Couldn't let that happen." As the ropes fell away, Rose rubbed her raw wrists, eyeing him suspiciously. "Why should we believe you?" Rylan glanced around at the dispersing crowd, then leaned closer. Because I'm offering you a choice, which is more than anyone else here would do. You can come work at my ranch paid, proper work, or I can give you enough money to take the next stage to California. Charlotte looked up, hope flickering in her tear-filled eyes. You would, let us go. I didn't buy you to own you, he said firmly. I bought you to free you. Rose stared at him, searching his face for any sign of deception. She found none, but years of disappointment had taught her caution. What kind of work? My housekeeper left 2 months back to marry a man in Prescott. Place needs a woman's touch, cooking, cleaning, that sort of thing. It's just me and 2 ranch hands. You'd have your own quarters, meals provided, and fair wages. Both of us? Rose asked, still skeptical. Rylan nodded. I won't let anyone separate you, that's a promise. There was something in his steady gaze that made Rose want to believe him. She looked at Charlotte, whose terrified expression had softened slightly. We'll come to your ranch, Rose decided. For now. Rylan nodded, understanding her reservation. My wagon's this way. We should leave before these vultures change their minds. He led them to a well-maintained wagon hitched to 2 sturdy horses. After helping them climb onto the wooden bench, he untied the reins and climbed up beside them. With a gentle flick, the horses began moving, pulling them away from the dusty town square and the nightmare of the auction block. As they left Ash Fork behind, Rose kept one arm firmly around Charlotte's shoulders, her other hand ready to grab the reins if their rescuer proved false. But Rylan Xavier kept his eyes on the road ahead, giving the sisters space to breathe and process what had happened. The wagon traveled along a rutted dirt road, leaving the small town behind and venturing into the expansive Arizona landscape. Red rock formations rose majestically against the clear blue sky, while scrubby junipers and pinyon pines dotted the terrain. It's about an hour to the ranch, Rylan explained, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Got a good spring that never runs dry, even in summer. Cattle do well enough, and we grow some crops too. Charlotte, always quicker to trust than her sister, ventured a question. How long have you lived here, Mr. Xavier? Going on 8 years now, he replied. Came west after the war, and it's just Rylan, if you don't mind. The war changed everything, Rose said quietly, thinking of their father who had returned from fighting for the Union a broken man, turning to gambling and drink to dull his memories. Rylan nodded, understanding in his eyes. That it did. Our father fought at Antietam, Charlotte offered. He wasn't the same after. Not many were, Rylan said simply. He didn't ask more, and Rose was grateful for his discretion. The wagon crested a hill, and Rylan pulled the horses to a stop, allowing the sisters their first view of his property. Spread before them was a valley of surprising greenery, with a creek winding through its center. A sturdy log house stood near a stand of cottonwood trees, smoke rising lazily from its chimney. Nearby was a large barn, several corrals, and what appeared to be a vegetable garden. Cattle grazed on the hillsides, small dark shapes against the golden grass. Xavier Ranch, he said, a note of pride in his voice. Not the biggest spread in Arizona, but it's mine, free and clear. Rose had to admit, it looked peaceful, far more appealing than the dusty chaos of Ash Fork or the uncertainty of striking out on their own. Still, she remained wary. Men rarely did anything without expecting something in return. As they approached the house, 2 figures emerged from the barn. One was an older man with a silver beard, the other younger with dark hair tied back at his neck. That's Hank Miller and Joe Blackwell, Rylan explained. Hank's been with me since the beginning, Joe for about 3 years. Good men, both of them. The wagon pulled up to the house, and Rylan set the brake before jumping down. He offered a hand first to Charlotte, then to Rose, who reluctantly accepted his assistance. "Boss, didn't expect you back so soon," called Hank, approaching with a curious expression. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of the sisters. "Hank, Joe, these are the Cavanaugh sisters, Rose and Charlotte," Rylan said. "They'll be taking over the housekeeping. Ladies, as I mentioned, this is Hank and Joe." Hank tipped his hat respectfully. "Madams, pleasure to make your acquaintance." Joe, younger and clearly more shy, merely nodded, his eyes darting away when they met Charlotte's. "Hank, could you show the ladies to Martha's old quarters? They'll need to get settled in. Joe, help me unhitch the team." As Hank led them toward the house, Rose heard Joe ask in a hushed voice, "You bought them at that auction, boss?" Rylan's reply was firm. "I bought their freedom, Joe. There's a difference." The answer gave Rose a small measure of reassurance, but she remained on guard. Life had taught her that kindness often came with conditions, especially from men. The housekeeper's quarters turned out to be a small but comfortable room attached to the main house, with a separate entrance for privacy. It contained a large bed that would easily fit both sisters, a washstand with a porcelain basin, a sturdy chest of drawers, and a small sitting area with 2 chairs near a window that overlooked the garden. "Martha left some things behind, clothes and such," Hank explained, showing them the contents of the chest. "Might not fit perfect, but they're clean. Bathrooms out back, kitchen through that door." He pointed to a door that connected their quarters to the main house. "Thank you," Charlotte said, offering the first genuine smile Rose had seen on her sister's face in weeks. Hank nodded, suddenly gruff. "Dinner's usually at sundown. Boss is a fair man. You'll be treated right here." With that, he excused himself, leaving the sisters alone. As soon as the door closed behind him, Charlotte sat heavily on the bed. "Rose, I think we might be safe here." Rose moved to the window, looking out at the ranch bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. "Maybe," she conceded, "but we need to be careful, Lottie. Men like Xavier don't spend $300 out of the goodness of their hearts." "He seems different," Charlotte argued. "He could have separated us, it would have been cheaper, but he didn't. He said he wouldn't let anyone separate us." Rose sighed, sitting beside her sister and taking her hand. "I want to believe that too, but I've made a promise to keep you safe, and I intend to honor it. We'll stay alert, work hard, save every penny he pays us, and if there's any sign of trouble, we'll leave. Understood?" Charlotte nodded reluctantly. "Yes, but I think you're being too suspicious. And you've always been too trusting," Rose countered with a small smile, tugging gently on one of her sister's blonde curls. "Between the two of us, perhaps we'll find the right balance." A soft knock at the door interrupted them. Rose tensed but called out, "Yes." The door opened to reveal Rylan, carrying a tray with a pitcher of water, 2 cups, and some bread and cheese. "Thought you might be hungry after the journey. Dinner won't be for a few hours yet." Charlotte jumped up to take the tray. "Thank you, Mr. Xavier Rylan. This is very kind," he shrugged, looking slightly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "It's nothing. There's hot water for washing up too whenever you're ready, left it heating on the stove." Rose stood, gathering her courage. "Mr. Xavier, I need to know exactly what you expect from us." His gray eyes met hers directly. "Cooking, cleaning, keeping the house in order, nothing more. And our wages. $20 a month each, plus room and board." It was a fair wage, more than fair, actually, and they both knew it. Rose felt some of her suspicion falter in the face of his straightforward answer. "One more thing," he added, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a key and held it out to Rose. "For your door. Lock it whenever you want. No one here will bother you, but I reckon you'll sleep better knowing you can." Rose took the key, genuinely surprised. "Thank you," Rylan nodded. "I'll leave you to rest. Kitchen's yours when you're ready to start exploring it." After he left, Rose turned the key over in her palm, feeling its solid weight. It was a small thing, this key, but it represented something significant: control over their own space, their own safety. "See," Charlotte said softly. "Different." Rose couldn't deny it, but she wasn't ready to surrender her caution entirely. "We'll see," she murmured, though for the first time since their father's death, she felt a tentative flicker of hope. The next morning, Rose woke before dawn, her body attuned to early rising from years of responsibility. Beside her, Charlotte slept peacefully, her golden hair spread across the pillow. Rose slipped quietly from the bed, dressed in one of the modest calico dresses left by the previous housekeeper, and made her way to the kitchen. She was surprised to find Rylan already there, stoking the fire in the cook stove. "Good morning," he said, straightening. "Wasn't sure if you'd be up this early." "I'm used to it," Rose replied, tying an apron around her waist. "You don't need to tend the fire, that's my job now." Rylan stepped back, raising his hands in mock surrender. "All yours. I'm just used to doing it since Martha left." Rose surveyed the kitchen. It was large and well-equipped, with a solid oak table in the center, plenty of cupboards, and a pantry stocked with staples. It was tidy enough, but she could see it needed a woman's touch. There was dust on the higher shelves, and the floor could use a good scrubbing. "What do you usually have for breakfast?" she asked, rolling up her sleeves. "Coffee, biscuits, some bacon or salt pork if we have it. Nothing fancy." Rose nodded and set to work, finding comfort in the familiar routine of cooking. By the time Charlotte joined her, she had coffee brewing, biscuit dough mixed, and bacon sizzling in a cast-iron skillet. "You should have woken me," Charlotte chided gently, quickly donning an apron to help. "You needed the rest," Rose replied. "Besides, it's just breakfast." Hank and Joe arrived as the food was being laid out, both men washing up at the pump outside before entering. They sat awkwardly at first, unused to female company, but Charlotte's natural warmth soon had them talking about the ranch and their daily routines. "We've got branding to finish today," Rylan explained between bites of biscuit. "We'll be out most of the day. The house is yours to get acquainted with." "It needs a good cleaning," Rose said frankly. "When was the last time anyone washed the curtains or beat the rugs?" The men exchanged guilty glances. "Might have been before Martha left," Hank admitted. "Then that's where we'll start," Rose decided. She had always found security in order and cleanliness, a way to control at least one aspect of her life when everything else felt uncertain. After the men departed for their day's work, the sisters tackled the house with vigor, grateful for physical labor to distract them from their recent ordeal. They took down curtains, beat rugs, scrubbed floors, and dusted every surface they could reach. By midday, they were sweaty and tired but had made significant progress. "Let's take a break," Charlotte suggested, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. "I saw some lemonade in the pantry. We could make some and sit in the shade for a bit." They took their glasses to the porch, settling on the steps where a large cottonwood provided relief from the sun. The view from the house was spectacular: rolling hills dotted with cattle, the distant mountains shimmering in the heat. "It's beautiful here," Charlotte murmured, sipping her lemonade. "Peaceful," Rose had to agree. After the chaos and fear of the past months, the quiet of the ranch was soothing. "It is, but don't get too comfortable, Lottie. This is temporary just until we save enough to make our own way." Charlotte gave her a sidelong glance. "Would it be so terrible if it wasn't temporary? If we found a home here?" "This isn't our home," Rose reminded her gently. "We're employees, nothing more." "For now," Charlotte replied with a small smile. "But things change, Rose, people change." Rose chose not to argue, knowing her sister's romantic nature often led her to see possibilities where none existed. Instead, she finished her lemonade and stood. We should get back to work. I want to have dinner ready when they return." By late afternoon, the house was transformed clean, organized and smelling of lemon oil and fresh air. Rose had found a well-stocked pantry and prepared a hearty stew with dumplings, fresh bread, and an apple cobbler for dessert. The kitchen table was set properly, with the best dishes she could find and wildflowers Charlotte had gathered in a simple glass jar as a centerpiece. When the men returned, dusty and tired from a day of hard labor, their surprise was evident. "Place hasn't looked this good since." Hank trailed off, looking around in wonder. "Since ever," Joe finished, sniffing the air appreciatively. "And something smells mighty fine." Rylan's eyes met Rose's across the room, and there was something in his gaze that made her flush slightly. "Thank you," he said simply. "Both of you." The meal was the most pleasant they'd had in months. The men, initially reserved, gradually relaxed in the sisters' company. Joe, though shy, proved to have a dry wit that made Charlotte laugh. Hank shared stories of the early days of the ranch, when he and Rylan had arrived with nothing but determination and a small herd of cattle. "Boss nearly got himself killed building that barn," Hank recalled, chuckling. "Roof beam came down, missed him by a hair." "Wouldn't have happened if someone had been holding the support properly," Rylan countered good-naturedly. As the evening progressed, Rose found herself watching Rylan covertly. He was different from the rough men of Ash Fork, educated, thoughtful, and possessed of a quiet dignity that commanded respect without demanding it. When he smiled, which was rarely, it transformed his serious face, revealing a dimple in his right cheek and crinkling the corners of his storm-gray eyes. After the meal, Charlotte insisted on playing the small piano in the corner of the living room, her fingers remembering the lessons of their more prosperous days. The simple melodies filled the house, bringing a gentleness to the rustic surroundings. Later, as Rose prepared for bed, she found herself thinking that perhaps, just perhaps, they had found a safe harbor after all. But she reminded herself firmly that safety was fleeting, and trust was a luxury she couldn't yet afford, especially when it came to a man who stirred unfamiliar feelings in her carefully guarded heart. The days at Xavier Ranch fell into a rhythm. Rose and Charlotte transformed the house into a home, adding small touches that made the space more welcoming: curtains refreshed with new trim, wildflowers arranged in simple containers, shelves organized with an eye for both function and beauty. Rose took charge of the kitchen, discovering that Rylan had a particular fondness for her apple pie, and making it more frequently than was strictly necessary. Charlotte tended the vegetable garden, coaxing it back from neglect with her gentle persistence, and befriended the chickens that provided eggs for their meals. The men, initially awkward around them, gradually became more comfortable. Joe, especially, seemed to seek out Charlotte's company, offering to help her with the heavier garden tasks or bringing her interesting stones or feathers he found while working. His shy attentions made Charlotte blush and Rose worry, though she had to admit the young man seemed genuine in his admiration. Rylan remained something of an enigma. He was unfailingly polite, appreciative of their work, and treated them with respect. He never entered their quarters, kept a proper distance, and ensured that Hank and Joe did the same. But sometimes, Rose would catch him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, his gray eyes thoughtful. One evening, about 3 weeks after their arrival, Rose was sitting on the porch after dinner, enjoying the cooler air and spectacular sunset painting the Arizona sky in shades of orange and purple. Charlotte was inside, teaching Joe to play a simple tune on the piano, their laughter drifting through the open window. Rylan emerged from the barn and, seeing Rose, approached the porch. "Mind if I join you?" She gestured to the empty chair beside her. "It's your porch." He settled into the chair with a sigh of contentment. "Beautiful evening." "It is," she agreed, feeling unaccountably nervous in his presence. They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun's final descent below the horizon. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. Rose realized it felt natural, peaceful even. "You've made quite a difference here," Rylan said finally. "The place hasn't felt like this since, well, ever." "Charlotte and I are grateful for the opportunity," Rose replied formally, falling back on politeness as a shield. "You've been very kind." Rylan turned to look at her directly. "I haven't done anything special, Miss Cavanaugh. Just treated you like human beings, which is no more than you deserve." "Rose," she said suddenly. "If I'm to call you Rylan, you should call me Rose." He smiled, that rare, transformative smile that made her heart beat a little faster. "Rose, then." Another comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the distant hooting of an owl beginning its nightly hunt. "May I ask you something personal?" Rose ventured finally, curiosity overcoming her usual reserve. "You may ask. I may not answer," he replied, but his tone was light. "Why did you really buy us that day? The truth." Rylan's expression sobered. He looked out at the darkening landscape for a long moment before answering. "My mother and sister were sold after my father died," he said quietly. "I was 14, away working at a neighbor's farm when it happened. By the time I got back, they were gone, separated, sold to different buyers. I never found them." Rose felt her throat tighten with emotion. "I'm so sorry." He shook his head slightly. "It was a long time ago, but when I saw you two on that platform, heard them talking about separating you, I couldn't let it happen, not when I could prevent it." His honesty touched something deep within Rose, breaking through a layer of the protective wall she had built around her heart. "Thank you," she whispered, meaning it more than she ever had before, "for keeping us together." Rylan's hand moved, almost as if he might reach for hers, but then seemed to think better of it. "You're welcome." From that evening, something shifted between them. Rose found herself seeking Rylan's company more often, and he seemed to linger in the kitchen while she worked, offering to help with tasks that had previously been solely her domain. They began to share pieces of their pasts. Rylan spoke of his time in the Union Army, the horrors he had seen, and his decision to seek a new life in the West after the war ended. Rose told him about her parents, her father's decline after returning from battle, and the desperate measures he had taken before his death that had led to their indenture. "He wasn't always like that," Rose explained one evening as they shelled peas together at the kitchen table. "Before the war, he was kind, gentle. He read to us every night, taught us about the stars. The man who came back was a stranger wearing our father's face." Rylan nodded in understanding. "War changes men. Some heal, some don't. Did you heal?" She glanced up at him, curious. He considered the question seriously. "Mostly. There are still nightmares sometimes, days when the memories are too close. But yes, I think I've healed as much as anyone can." Their conversations deepened as summer turned to fall. Rylan shared his dreams for the ranch, his hope to expand the herd and perhaps build a larger house someday. Rose found herself imagining such a future, then chiding herself for the foolish fantasy. Meanwhile, Charlotte and Joe's friendship blossomed into a sweet, innocent courtship. He brought her wildflowers, carved small wooden animals for her, and listened with rapt attention to her stories of life back east. Rose watched their growing attachment with a mixture of happiness for her sister and concern about what it might mean for their plans to eventually leave. One crisp October morning, Rose was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard the sound of approaching horses. Looking up, She saw 3 riders approaching from the direction of town strangers, not the familiar figures of Rylan or his ranch hands who were working the north pasture that day. Something about the men's posture set her on edge. She quickly finished pinning a shirt to the line and hurried inside to find Charlotte. "Visitors coming," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "I don't recognize them." Charlotte peered out the window. "Should we hide?" "No," Rose decided after a moment's thought. "This is our home now. We have nothing to fear." The words surprised her even as she spoke them. When had she begun thinking of the ranch as home? The riders drew up to the hitching post out front. Rose stepped onto the porch, Charlotte slightly behind her as the men dismounted. The leader, a heavy-set man with a bushy mustache and expensive clothing, looked them over with obvious interest. "Well, well," he said, removing his hat. Lester Donovan said Xavier had bought himself some pretty housekeepers, but he didn't mention how pretty. Rose stiffened at the mention of the slave trader who had sold them. "Mr. Xavier isn't here at present. May I ask your business?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his small, pig-like eyes. "Name Sullivan, Thomas Sullivan. I own the largest ranch in the territory and the bank in Ash Fork." Just being neighborly, calling on Xavier to discuss some business. Rose didn't like the way he was looking at Charlotte, as if assessing her value. "I'll tell Mr. Xavier you called. Good day, Mr. Sullivan." She turned to go inside, but Sullivan's voice stopped her. "Now don't be hasty, darling. We've ridden a fair piece. Least you could do is offer some refreshment to weary travelers." Instinct told Rose to refuse, but hospitality was sacred in the West, even to unwelcome guests. "Very well. There's coffee ready. You may wait on the porch." She retreated inside, pulling Charlotte with her. "I don't trust them," she whispered. "Especially that Sullivan. Stay inside while I bring them coffee." Charlotte nodded, eyes wide. "Should we send for Rylan?" "How? The men are all at the north pasture." Rose bit her lip, thinking. "We'll just have to handle this ourselves. With luck, they'll drink their coffee and leave." She prepared a tray with coffee and some leftover biscuits, then carried it out to the porch where the 3 men had made themselves comfortable. Sullivan had taken Rylan's chair, while his companion's younger men with hard eyes leaned against the porch railing. "Thank you kindly, miss." Sullivan let the words hang, clearly fishing for her name. "Cavanaugh," she replied shortly, setting down the tray. "Ah, the Cavanaugh sisters. Lester mentioned you were being sold to cover your daddy's gambling debts. Shame about that." There was no sympathy in his voice, only calculated interest. "I was in Prescott that day, or I might have bid on you myself." Rose poured coffee with steady hands, though her heart was racing. "As I said, Mr. Xavier will be back later. I'll tell him you called." Sullivan ignored her dismissal, sipping his coffee. "Fine brew. You keep a good house for Xavier. Man's lucky to have acquired such assets." One of the younger men snickered, and Rose felt her cheeks burn with anger and humiliation. "Mr. Xavier didn't acquire us," she said coldly. "We're employed here, paid a fair wage." Sullivan raised an eyebrow. "Is that what he tells you? Interesting. Not what I heard in town." Before Rose could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew everyone's attention. Relief flooded through her as she recognized Rylan's tall figure leading Hank and Joe back to the ranch. They must have finished their work early. Rylan's expression darkened as he took in the scene on his porch. He dismounted quickly, handing his reins to Joe, and strode toward the house. "Sullivan," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "What brings you to my property?" Sullivan stood, setting down his coffee cup. "Xavier, just being neighborly, thought we might discuss that water rights issue again." "Nothing to discuss," Rylan replied shortly. "The springs on my land has been since I bought it fair and square from the territory office." "Everything's for sale at the right price," Sullivan countered, his gaze sliding to Rose and then toward the house where Charlotte watched through the window. Everything. Rylan stepped closer, placing himself between Sullivan and Rose. Not everything. And now I think it's time you and your men moved on. Sullivan's smile turned ugly. You're making a mistake, Xavier. A man in your position can't afford to make enemies. A man in my position can't afford to sell his principles either, Rylan replied evenly. Good day, Sullivan. The tension was palpable as Sullivan stared at Rylan, clearly unused to being dismissed. Finally, he jammed his hat back on his head. This isn't over. That spring water feeds my south pasture, and I mean to have it. The water crosses your land after it leaves mine, Rylan said firmly. You're welcome to it then, same as always. Sullivan's eyes narrowed, but he gestured to his men. They mounted up, Sullivan pausing to look back at Rose. Pleasure meeting you, Miss Cavanaugh. Perhaps we'll meet again, under different circumstances. The threat was thinly veiled, and Rose felt a chill despite the warm afternoon sun. As the riders disappeared down the road, she turned to Rylan. I'm sorry. I didn't know what to do when they arrived. You did fine, he assured her, his eyes still on the departing riders. Sullivan's been trying to buy my land for years. He's not used to being refused, he seemed. Dangerous, Rose said quietly. Rylan nodded grimly. He is. Sullivan wants to control all the water in this part of the territory. He's already bought out 3 smaller ranches that couldn't survive without access to his streams. But your spring protects you, Rose realized. Exactly. As long as I have my own water source, he can't force me out. Rylan turned to her, concern evident in his expression. Did he say anything to frighten you? Rose hesitated, then decided on honesty. He mentioned Lester Donovan, the man who sold us. He implied that, she paused, finding it difficult to continue. That I bought you for something other than housekeeping, Rylan finished, his jaw tightening. Sullivan's specialty is twisting the truth to suit his purposes. I know that's not why you helped us, Rose said quickly, wanting to reassure him. Rylan's eyes softened as they met hers. Thank you for that. He hesitated, then added, Rose, Sullivan's not a man to cross. I want you and Charlotte to be extra careful while he's making these threats. Don't go anywhere alone, especially not to town. The protective note in his voice warmed her. We'll be careful. That evening at dinner, the mood was subdued as Rylan explained Sullivan's history in the territory, to the sisters his gradual accumulation of land and water rights, the rumors of intimidation and violence against those who opposed him, and his growing influence with territorial officials. Man wants to be cattle king of Arizona, Hank added, shaking his head. Won't be satisfied until he owns everything from here to the Colorado River. But he can't just take your land, can he? Charlotte asked, her eyes wide with concern. Rylan shook his head. Not legally. But Sullivan doesn't always operate within the law. What will you do? Rose asked quietly. What I've always done. Stand my ground. Rylan's voice was calm, but Rose saw the worry in his eyes. That night, as the sisters prepared for bed, Charlotte voiced what Rose had been thinking. If Sullivan is so dangerous, perhaps we should leave. We could go to California like Rylan originally offered. And leave them to face Sullivan alone. Rose shook her head. No, Lottie. This is our home now, too. We won't be driven away by threats. Charlotte smiled, slipping into bed. I was hoping you'd say that. I don't want to leave Joe, or the ranch. Rose blew out the lamp and climbed in beside her sister. Go to sleep, Lottie. But sleep eluded Rose that night. She kept thinking of Sullivan's threatening manner, of Rylan standing protectively between her and danger, and of her own surprising declaration that the ranch was now their home. When had that happened? When had her carefully constructed walls begun to crumble? The answer came to her in the darkness. It had been happening gradually since that first evening on the porch, when Rylan had shared the story of his lost family. With each conversation, each shared meal, each moment of unexpected kindness, she had found herself caring more deeply for this quiet, honorable man and the home he had built. The realization was both frightening and exhilarating. For the first time since their parents' deaths, Rose allowed herself to imagine a future that included not just security and independence, but also love. It was a dangerous hope, she knew, especially with Sullivan's threats hanging over them. But once acknowledged, it refused to be dismissed. Over the next few weeks, life at Xavier Ranch continued outwardly as normal, but there was an underlying tension that hadn't existed before. Rylan and his men began taking rifles with them when they worked the distant pastures. The doors were locked at night, and a loaded shotgun stood in the corner of the kitchen. Joe taught Charlotte how to use it, despite her initial reluctance, and Rose often caught Rylan watching the road with a worried expression. Sullivan's threats weren't idle. First, several head of cattle disappeared from the north pasture, too many for ordinary rustling. Then, returning from Ash Fork one afternoon, Hank reported that the bank had suddenly called in the small loan Rylan had taken to buy new breeding stock. "Sullivan's behind it," Rylan said grimly when Hank delivered the news. "Putting on the pressure." "Can you pay it?" Rose asked, concerned. Rylan nodded. "Yes, but it'll take most of our cash reserves. He's hoping to leave us vulnerable before winter sets in." The pressure escalated when the general store in Ash Fork suddenly refused to sell supplies to Rylan or his men, claiming they had exclusive contracts with Sullivan's ranch. Joe had to ride all the way to Prescott for basic provisions, a journey that took 2 days. Through it all, Rylan remained steady, his determination never wavering. But Rose could see the toll it was taking on him, the new lines of worry around his eyes, the way he sometimes sat alone on the porch late into the night, planning his next move in this dangerous game. One evening in early November, after a day of preserving the last garden vegetables for winter, Rose found Rylan in his small office adjacent to the living room. He was surrounded by papers, ledgers open before him, his expression troubled in the lamplight. "May I come in?" she asked softly from the doorway. He looked up, his face relaxing slightly at the sight of her. "Of course." Rose entered, setting a cup of coffee on the desk beside him. "I thought you might need this." "Thank you." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Please sit if you'd like." She settled into the chair, hands folded in her lap. "Is it very bad?" Rylan sighed, pushing the ledgers aside. "Not yet, but Sullivan's squeezing tighter. The bank's called in another note, and I've heard he's hiring more men, not ranch hands, but gunmen." "What will you do?" "Fight if I have to." He met her gaze directly. "Rose, I need to ask something of you and Charlotte. If things get worse, if there's real trouble, I want you both to leave. Go to Prescott, take the stage to California." "No," she said immediately. "We won't abandon you. This isn't your fight," he insisted. "Isn't it?" Rose challenged, leaning forward. "You saved us, Rylan. Gave us back our freedom, our dignity, a home. How can you think we wouldn't stand by you now?" The intensity in her voice seemed to surprise him. He studied her face for a long moment before speaking. "Rose, he stopped, seeming to struggle with his words. "What is it?" she prompted gently. "I care for you," he said finally, the simple declaration carrying more weight than flowery protestations might have. "More than I should, perhaps, given the circumstances of our meeting. If anything happened to you because of me, because of my quarrel with Sullivan." Rose's heart beat faster at his confession. "I care for you too," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've tried to keep my distance, but... He encouraged, hope kindling in his eyes. "But my heart wouldn't listen to reason." she finished with a small, rueful smile. Rylan reached across the desk, offering his hand palm up. After only a moment's hesitation, Rose placed her hand in his, feeling the strength and warmth of his fingers as they closed around hers. "I never expected this," he confessed. "When I saw you on that auction block, all I wanted was to help to right a wrong. I didn't imagine that we might come to mean something to each other." Rose finished for him. He nodded. "It complicates things." "Life is complicated," she countered. "That doesn't mean we should run from it." Rylan's thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand, sending a pleasant shiver up her arm. "No, it doesn't, but Sullivan is a problem we'll face together," Rose insisted. "All of us. This is our home now, Rylan. Charlotte and I aren't leaving." He looked like he might argue further, but instead he simply raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. The gesture, so unexpectedly tender, brought tears to Rose's eyes. "Together, then," he agreed softly. The moment was interrupted by the sound of rapidly approaching horses. Rylan was on his feet instantly, releasing Rose's hand and reaching for the rifle that leaned against his desk. "Stay here," he ordered, moving quickly toward the front of the house. Rose ignored the command, following close behind. Through the window, they could see 3 riders approaching in the gathering dusk. But unlike Sullivan's daytime visit, these riders moved with purpose, spreading out as they neared the house. "Get Charlotte and stay in your room," Rylan said urgently. "Lock the door." This time, Rose didn't argue. She hurried to find her sister, who was in the kitchen with Joe, the two of them laughing over some shared joke. "Riders coming," Rose said tersely. "Joe, Rylan needs you." The young man immediately sobered, grabbing his revolver from its holster hanging by the door and heading toward the front of the house. Rose took Charlotte's arm, leading her toward their quarters. "What's happening?" Charlotte asked, fear evident in her voice. "I'm not sure," Rose admitted, closing and locking their door. "But it doesn't look friendly." Through their window, they could see Rylan, Hank, and Joe taking positions on the porch, rifles ready. The riders had stopped about 50 yards from the house, just visible in the fading light. "Xavier." A voice called out. "Sullivan wants an answer. You selling or not?" "Not." Rylan's reply was immediate and firm. "Tell Sullivan if he wants to talk, he can come himself in daylight." "He figured you'd say that," the voice replied. "Said to give you a message." The sharp crack of a rifle shot split the night. Charlotte gasped as the window beside them shattered, sending glass flying across the room. Rose pulled her sister to the floor, covering Charlotte's body with her own as more shots rang out. The men on the porch returned fire, the exchange brief but intense. Rose heard a cry of pain from outside, then the sound of retreating hoofbeats. "Stay down," she told Charlotte, reaching for the shotgun they kept in their room. With the weapon ready, she moved cautiously toward their door, unlocking it and peering out. "Rose, Charlotte," Rylan's voice came from the kitchen. "Are you all right? We're here," Rose called back, relief flooding through her at the sound of his voice. "We're unharmed." She opened the door wider to see Rylan rushing toward them, his face pale with concern. Behind him, Hank was helping Joe into a chair, the younger man clutching his arm where blood seeped through his fingers. "Joe's hit," Rylan explained quickly, his eyes scanning Rose for injuries. "Not too bad, but he'll need tending." "I'll get the medicine box," Charlotte said immediately, her fear forgotten in the face of Joe's need. She hurried to retrieve the supplies they kept for emergencies, while Rose moved to examine the wounded ranch hand. The bullet had grazed Joe's upper arm, tearing the flesh but not lodging in the muscle. It was painful but not life-threatening. Rose cleaned and bandaged the wound while Charlotte hovered anxiously nearby, holding Joe's other hand and murmuring words of comfort. "Did you hit any of them?" Rose asked Rylan as she worked. He nodded grimly. At least one. There was a blood trail heading west. Sullivan's men. Almost certainly, though he'll deny it. After Joe was patched up and given a dose of laudanum for the pain, Rylan insisted on checking the sister's room. The window was beyond repair, the glass scattered across the floor and the frame splintered by the bullet that had come frighteningly close to where they had been sitting. "You'll stay in my room tonight," Rylan decided. "I'll bunk with Hank and Joe in the bunkhouse." "That's not necessary," Rose began to protest. "It is," he insisted. "That window can't be secured, and I'm not leaving you too vulnerable to another attack." His concern was touching, but Rose was practical. "Your room only has one bed, and it's yours for tonight," he said firmly. No arguments. Too tired to protest further, Rose agreed. She and Charlotte quickly gathered their nightclothes and personal items, then followed Rylan to his room at the opposite end of the house. It was a simply furnished space, a large bed with a quilt in geometric patterns, a chest of drawers, a washstand, and a desk piled with books. It smelled faintly of leather soap, and something uniquely Rylan. "I'll be close by if you need anything," he promised, lingering in the doorway after showing them in. His eyes met Rose's, conveying what he couldn't say with Charlotte present. "Try to get some rest." After he left, Charlotte sat heavily on the edge of the bed. "They really could have killed us, couldn't they?" Rose nodded soberly. "They could have. What will happen now?" "I don't know," Rose admitted, sitting beside her sister and putting an arm around her shoulders. "But I know Rylan won't let Sullivan win without a fight." Charlotte leaned against her. "Joe could have died protecting us. But he didn't," Rose reminded her gently. "He'll be fine." "I love him, Rose," Charlotte confessed, tears filling her eyes. "I know it hasn't been very long, but I do. And tonight when I saw him bleeding." Rose hugged her sister tightly. "I know, Lottie, I understand." And she did understand far better than Charlotte knew. The fear she had felt when those shots were fired hadn't been solely for her own safety, or even Charlotte's. Her first thought had been of Rylan, exposed on the porch, facing danger to protect them all. As they prepared for bed in Rylan's room, Rose found herself touching his things, the worn spine of a book of poetry that surprised her, the smooth handle of his shaving brush, the soft fabric of a shirt hanging on a hook. These small intimacies made her blush, but also deepened her connection to him. This was the private space of the man she had come to love, and being in it felt both intrusive and comforting. Sleep came fitfully that night, disturbed by every creak of the house and whisper of wind outside. Rose lay awake long after Charlotte had drifted off, thinking about the escalating conflict with Sullivan and what it might mean for all of them. The next morning brought no reprieve. Rylan rode to town at first light, returning with grim news. Sullivan had filed a legal claim against Xavier Ranch, alleging that the original land grant had been improperly recorded and that the water rights belonged to him. "It's nonsense, of course," Rylan explained to them all as they gathered around the kitchen table. "My deed is in order. But Sullivan has the judge in his pocket, and it could tie us up in court for months we can't afford." "What can we do?" Joe asked, his injured arm in a sling but his determination undiminished. "Fight it legally as long as we can," Rylan decided, "and prepare for trouble." Over the next few days, they fortified the ranch as best they could. The broken window was boarded up and the remaining windows reinforced. Extra ammunition was distributed, and someone stayed on watch through the night. Hank rode to neighboring ranches, seeking support against Sullivan's encroachment, but returned discouraged. "Most are too scared to cross him," he reported. "A few said they'd stand with us if it comes to a fight, but they won't speak out publicly." The tension was wearing on all of them. Charlotte became jumpy at unexpected sounds. Joe was frustrated by his inability to work properly with his injured arm, and Hank grew more taciturn than usual. Only Rylan maintained his steady calm, though Rose could see the strain in the tightness around his eyes and mouth. For Rose, the most difficult part was the uncertainty. During the day, she kept busy with household tasks, cooking hearty meals to sustain them all and doing whatever she could to maintain normalcy. But at night, alone with her thoughts, she worried about what the future might hold. Despite the tension, or perhaps because of it, her relationship with Rylan deepened. They found moments to be alone together, brief interludes where they could share their fears and hopes. One evening, as they walked the short distance to the garden to harvest vegetables for dinner, Rylan took her hand in his. "If things were different," he said quietly, "if we weren't facing this fight with Sullivan, I'd be courting you properly." Rose squeezed his hand. "I don't need proper courting, I just need you to be safe." He stopped, turning to face her, still holding her hand. "Rose, I want you to know, whatever happens, meeting you and Charlotte, bringing you here, it's the best thing I've ever done. You've made this place a home in ways I never imagined possible." "Rylan," she began, but he gently placed a finger against her lips. "Let me finish. If Sullivan forces me out, if I lose the ranch, I'd understand if you and Charlotte wanted to go your own way. You've saved some money now, you could make a fresh start." Rose shook her head firmly, removing his finger from her lips to hold his hand in both of hers. "Listen to me, Rylan Xavier. I'm not here because of this land or this house. I'm here because of you. Where you go, I go." The conviction in her voice seemed to touch him deeply. His free hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb gently tracing the line of her cheekbone. "Rose Cavanaugh," he murmured. "How did I get so lucky?" "It wasn't luck," she replied softly. "It was courage, yours, when you stood up on that terrible day in Ash Fork and said you wouldn't let us be separated." Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward. Rose closed her eyes as his lips met hers in a tender, questioning kiss. Her hands released his to slide up his chest and around his neck, answering his question with the gentle pressure of her lips against his. The kiss deepened, expressing all the emotions they had been holding back: fear, hope, longing, and a love that had grown steadily stronger despite the circumstances that threatened to tear them apart. When they finally parted, both breathing a little faster, Rylan rested his forehead against hers. "When this is over," he promised, "when Sullivan is no longer a threat, I'm going to ask you a very important question." Rose's heart quickened. "And I'm going to say yes." His smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. He kissed her once more, briefly but with feeling, before they reluctantly resumed their walk to the garden, both aware that they couldn't afford to be distracted for too long. That night, Sullivan's men made another attempt. This time, they targeted the barn, setting fire to its south side while the household slept. It was only Hank's vigilance on watch that prevented disaster. His warning shout roused everyone in time to form a bucket line from the well to the barn, fighting the blaze before it could spread to the main structure or the house. By dawn, they were exhausted, smoke-stained, and angry but victorious. The barn had sustained damage but was still standing. More concerning were the hoofprints leading away from the ranch more than a dozen horses, suggesting Sullivan was escalating his campaign. "Next time it could be worse," Hank said grimly, washing soot from his hands at the kitchen pump. "There won't be a next time," Rylan decided, his expression harder than Rose had ever seen it. "It's time to end this." Later that morning, after a few hours of much-needed rest, Rylan gathered everyone in the kitchen to outline his plan. "Sullivan wants a confrontation," he explained. He's trying to provoke us into making a move he can use against us legally or force us to abandon the ranch. So we're going to give him what he doesn't expect, a public challenge." "What kind of challenge?" Joe asked, leaning forward eagerly despite his injured arm. "I'm riding into Ash Fork today to challenge Sullivan to settle this man-to-man in front of witnesses. No hired guns, no lawyers, no burning barns in the night, just him and me." Rose felt her blood run cold. "Rylan, no, Sullivan won't fight fair." "He won't have a choice," Rylan countered. "I'll make the challenge in front of half the town. If he refuses, his reputation suffers. If he accepts but cheats, everyone will know. And if he kills you—" Rose's voice was barely audible. Rylan's expression softened as he looked at her. "That's a risk I have to take." "I won't let him terrorize us anymore, Rose. This ends today, one way or another." There was no dissuading him. Rylan was determined to confront Sullivan, to force a resolution to the conflict that had been building for weeks. All Rose could do was help him prepare, her heart heavy with fear but understanding his need to protect what was his. "I'm coming with you," she announced as he saddled his horse. Rylan turned to her in surprise. "It's too dangerous." "Precisely why I'm coming," she replied firmly. "Sullivan needs to see that you're not alone, that we stand together." He started to protest, then seemed to reconsider. "All right," he agreed finally, "but you stay back if there's trouble." Rose nodded, though they both knew she was unlikely to keep that promise if Rylan was in danger. They rode to Ash Fork together, accompanied by Hank. Charlotte and Joe remained at the ranch, armed and vigilant in case Sullivan had planned a diversion. The small town was busy with its usual midday activities, wagons loading supplies at the general store, horses tied outside the saloon, women shopping for household necessities. Rylan headed directly for the largest building on the main street, Sullivan's Bank. As they dismounted, Rose could feel eyes on them, townspeople noticing their arrival and sensing the tension in Rylan's purposeful stride. Inside the bank, a clerk looked up in surprise as they entered. "Mr. Xavier," he stammered, "we weren't expecting, where's Sullivan?" Rylan interrupted, his voice carrying in the quiet space. "In his office, but he's not seeing visitors today," the clerk replied nervously. "He'll see me." Rylan moved past the counter toward the door marked T. Sullivan, President, at the rear of the building. The clerk half rose from his chair, then subsided as Hank gave him a warning look. Rose followed Rylan, her heart pounding but her steps steady. Without knocking, Rylan pushed open Sullivan's door. The banker looked up from his desk, momentary surprise quickly replaced by a calculating smile. "Xavier," he drawled, leaning back in his chair. "Come to accept my offer at last." "I've come to end this," Rylan replied. "Your men shot my ranch hand, tried to burn my barn, and terrorized these women. It stops now." Sullivan's gaze shifted to Rose, his smile widening unpleasantly. "Miss Cavanaugh, a pleasure to see you again. Has Xavier been treating you well? Or perhaps you'd prefer a change of employment?" Rose felt her cheeks burn with anger, but before she could respond, Rylan stepped forward, placing his hands on Sullivan's desk and leaning down to look the banker in the eye. "I'm challenging you, Sullivan. Man to man. No hired guns, no lawyers. Just you and me settling this once and for all." Sullivan's eyebrows rose. How primitive. And what exactly would this settlement involve? A fight. Fair and square. "If I win, you leave Xavier Ranch alone, no more legal claims, no more threats, no more nighttime visitors. If you win." Rylan hesitated, then continued firmly, "If you win, the ranch is yours." "No," Rose gasped, stunned by the stakes Rylan was proposing. Sullivan's eyes gleamed with interest. "Intriguing, and what about your household?" His gaze lingered on Rose. Would they be included in this wager? Rylan's hands clenched into fists on the desk. The people aren't property, Sullivan. They go where they choose. Of course, Sullivan agreed with false cordiality. I was merely curious. He stroked his mustache, considering the offer. When would this contest take place? Today. 1 hour. In the street outside so the whole town can witness. Sullivan studied Rylan for a long moment, then looked past him to where curious onlookers had begun to gather in the doorway, drawn by the raised voices. His lips curved in a calculating smile. Very well, Xavier. 1 hour. A gentleman's contest to settle our disagreement. He rose, extending his hand across the desk. May the best man win. Rylan didn't take the offered hand. 1 hour, he repeated, then turned and strode out of the office, Rose and Hank following close behind. Outside the bank, Rose grabbed Rylan's arm. Have you lost your mind? You're wagering the ranch on a fight. It was the only way to get him to agree, Rylan explained, leading them toward the saloon. Sullivan's too proud to refuse a public challenge, especially one that makes him look like the equal of a mere rancher like me. But if you lose, I won't lose, Rylan assured her. His confidence wasn't arrogance, she knew, but a quiet certainty born of necessity. He couldn't afford to lose, not just for his own sake, but for all of them. Word spread quickly through Ash Fork. By the time Rylan, Rose, and Hank emerged from the saloon where they had fortified themselves with coffee and a quick meal, a crowd had gathered in the wide main street. Men from surrounding ranches, townspeople, and even women and children lined the boardwalks, eager to witness the confrontation between the powerful banker and the stubborn rancher. Sullivan arrived with an entourage, his ranch foreman, several gunmen trying to look like ordinary cowboys, and a few town officials who owed their positions to his influence. He had changed into a fine waistcoat and removed his suit jacket, looking more like a man preparing for a social event than a fight. Quite an audience, he remarked to Rylan as they met in the center of the street. Pity they'll see your humiliation. Rylan ignored the taunt, removing his own coat and handing it to Hank. Rose stood nearby, her hands clasped tightly together, praying silently for Rylan's safety. The town marshal, a gray-haired man named Peterson who was one of the few officials not in Sullivan's pocket, stepped forward to establish the rules. Straight fight, gentlemen. No weapons, no outside interference. It ends when one man yields or can't continue. Both men nodded their agreement. The crowd formed a rough circle around them, creating an impromptu arena in the dusty street. At Peterson's signal, the fight began. Sullivan was heavier and slightly younger than Rylan, but years of desk work had softened him. He moved with surprising quickness for his size, however, landing the first blow a solid punch to Rylan's jaw that sent him staggering back a step. Rose gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, but Rylan recovered quickly. He dodged Sullivan's next swing and countered with a sharp jab to the banker's midsection that drove the air from his lungs. The fight was brutal, an unrefined no-boxing match with formal rules, but a frontier brawl where only the outcome mattered. Sullivan fought dirty, trying to knee Rylan and throw dust in his eyes. Rylan fought with the controlled power of a man accustomed to physical labor, his movements economical and effective. Blood streaked both men's faces as the fight continued, neither willing to yield. Sullivan landed a powerful blow to Rylan's ribs that made him wince in pain. But Rylan responded with a combination of punches that sent Sullivan reeling back into the crowd. The turning point came when Sullivan, growing desperate as his strength began to flag, reached into his boot and pulled a small derringer. The crowd gasped, and Rose cried out in warning, but Rylan had already seen the weapon. He lunged forward, catching Sullivan's wrist before he could aim, and the two men grappled for control of the gun. There was a deafening crack as the derringer discharged, the bullet harmlessly embedding itself in the dirt. Rylan wrenched the weapon from Sullivan's grasp and tossed it aside, then delivered a powerful right hook that sent the banker crashing to the ground. Sullivan tried to rise but couldn't. Blood streaming from his nose and a cut above his eye, he glared up at Rylan, who stood over him, battered but unbowed. "Yield," Rylan demanded, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent street. For a moment, it seemed Sullivan might refuse. Then, seeing the condemnation in the eyes of the townspeople who had witnessed his attempted cheating, he slumped back in defeat. "I yield," he muttered. A cheer erupted from many in the crowd, the smaller ranchers who had suffered under Sullivan's tactics, townspeople who resented his control, and those who simply appreciated seeing justice prevail. Marshal Peterson stepped forward, raising Rylan's hand. "Xavier wins. The contest is decided." Rose rushed to Rylan's side, concern evident in her eyes as she examined his injuries. "You're hurt." "Not badly," he assured her, wincing slightly as she touched a bruise forming on his cheek. "Nothing that won't heal." Sullivan had been helped to his feet by his men, his expression a mixture of pain and fury. "This isn't over, Xavier," he growled. "Yes, it is," Marshal Peterson interjected firmly. "You made a wager before witnesses and lost fair and square, or rather, you lost after trying to cheat, which is worse. The matter is settled." Sullivan glared at them all, then turned and limped away, surrounded by his entourage. As they departed, the atmosphere in the street lightened, people converging on Rylan to offer congratulations and support. To Rose's surprise, several townspeople approached her as well. The general store owner's wife pressed her hand warmly. "We're glad to see Sullivan taken down a peg. Your man did what many have wanted to do for years." "My man," Rose repeated softly, looking at Rylan, who was accepting a handkerchief from Hank to wipe the blood from his face. The phrase felt right in a way she hadn't expected. Later, as they prepared to ride back to the ranch, Rylan pulled Rose aside. Despite his bruised face and split lip, he was smiling a real, unguarded smile that transformed his features. "It's over," he said, taking her hands in his. "Sullivan won't risk his reputation by coming after us again, not after being publicly humiliated." "Are you certain?" Rose asked, still concerned. Rylan nodded. "Men like Sullivan care about their standing more than anything. He'll nurse his wounds and his pride, but he'll find easier targets." Relief washed over her, and with it, a wave of emotion so strong it brought tears to her eyes. "I was so afraid," she admitted, "when he pulled that gun." "I know." He squeezed her hands gently. "But it's done now. We can go home, Rose. We can start thinking about the future instead of just surviving day to day. Home." The word held such promise now. "What kind of future?" she asked softly. Rylan glanced around at the crowded street, then back to her. "Not here. When we get home, when it's just us." "I have something important to ask you." Her heart quickened at the look in his eyes. "I'll hold you to that promise." The ride back to Xavier Ranch was filled with a lightness that had been absent for weeks. Hank rode ahead, eager to share the news with Charlotte and Joe, while Rose and Rylan followed at a more leisurely pace, their horses side by side. As they approached the ranch, Rose could see Charlotte and Joe waiting anxiously on the porch. When they spotted the returning riders, their postures relaxed visibly. Charlotte ran to meet them, her face alight with relief when Hank called out the good news. He did it. Boss showed Sullivan what's what. The reunion was joyous, with Charlotte fussing over Rylan's bruises and Joe lamenting that he had missed seeing Sullivan get his comeuppance. The atmosphere at dinner that evening was celebratory, despite Rylan's injuries and everyone's exhaustion. They had faced a threat together and emerged victorious, not just intact, but stronger as a family. Family. The word echoed in Rose's mind as she looked around the table at these people who had become so dear to her in such a relatively short time. Hank with his gruff exterior and kind heart. Joe, whose gentle affection for Charlotte was evident in every glance. Charlotte herself, blossoming in the safety and love she had found at the ranch. And Rylan, the man who had saved them from a terrible fate and given them not just shelter and work, but respect and, eventually, love. After the meal, as Charlotte and Joe cleared the table and Hank retired to the bunkhouse, Rylan caught Rose's eye. With a small nod toward the porch, he rose and slipped outside. Rose followed a moment later, her heart beating faster with anticipation. The November evening was cool but not uncomfortable, the sky a canopy of stars above the darkened landscape. Rylan stood at the porch railing, looking out at the land he had fought for, his profile illuminated by the soft glow from the house windows. Rose moved to stand beside him, their shoulders almost touching. "Your face must be painful," she said gently, noting the bruises that had darkened over the course of the day. He shrugged. "Worth it." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, each absorbing the peace of the evening and the relief of danger past. "Rose," Rylan began finally, turning to face her. "When I rode into Ash Fork that day and saw you and Charlotte on that platform, I was only thinking of doing what was right. I had no idea how much you would both come to mean to me." She smiled, reaching up to gently touch his uninjured cheek. "You were our hero that day, whether you meant to be or not." He caught her hand, holding it against his face for a moment before lowering it to clasp between both of his. "I'm no hero, just a man who couldn't stand by and watch an injustice." "That's what heroes are," she countered softly. Rylan shook his head slightly, wincing at the movement. "Maybe, but what I want to be now is something different." He took a deep breath, his gray eyes serious in the starlight. "I want to be your husband, Rose, if you'll have me." Though she had been expecting it, the proposal still made her breath catch. "Are you sure?" "After everything that's happened with Sullivan, I've never been more sure of anything," he interrupted gently. "Sullivan made me realize what's truly important. This land, this ranch, it matters to me, but not as much as you do, not as much as the life we could build here together." Rose felt tears welling in her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you, Rylan Xavier." The joy that spread across his face was worth every hardship they had endured. He pulled her into his arms, mindful of his injuries, and kissed her with a tenderness that belied his rugged appearance. Rose melted into the embrace, feeling for the first time in years that she had truly found where she belonged. When they parted, both slightly breathless, Rylan rested his forehead against hers. "I don't have a ring yet," he admitted, "but I'll ride to Prescott next week and find one worthy of you." "I don't need a ring," Rose assured him. "I just need you. You have me," he promised, "for as long as I live." Their quiet moment was interrupted by a squeal of delight from the doorway. Charlotte stood there, her hands clasped over her mouth, eyes wide with excitement. "I knew it," she exclaimed. "I just came to ask if you wanted coffee and—" "Oh, Rose!" She rushed forward to embrace her sister, then Rylan, apparently forgetting his injuries until he winced. "Oh, I'm sorry." "It's all right," he laughed, the sound warm in the cool night air. Joe appeared in the doorway, looking confused until Charlotte turned to him with a radiant smile. "They're getting married." Understanding dawned on his face, followed by a broad grin. "Well, it's about time, boss." Hank, apparently drawn by the commotion, emerged from the bunkhouse. Upon hearing the news, he removed his hat in a rare gesture of respect. "Couldn't have happened to better folks," he said gruffly, genuine emotion in his weathered face. As Charlotte peppered them with questions about wedding plans, and Joe pounded Rylan carefully on the back in congratulation, Rose felt a contentment she had never expected to find again after the tragedies that had befallen her family. From the auction block in Ash Fork to this moment of pure joy on the porch of what was now truly her home, it was a journey she could scarcely have imagined. Rylan's arm slipped around her waist, drawing her close to his side as they faced their makeshift family together. "Happy," he murmured into her hair. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied honestly, leaning into his strength and feeling for the first time in years, completely and utterly safe. The wedding took place the following spring, when wildflowers carpeted the hills around Xavier Ranch, and the worst of winter's grip had loosened. They chose to hold the ceremony at home, beneath the spreading branches of the cottonwood trees near the creek. Reverend Thompson rode out from Ash Fork to perform the service, and neighbors from miles around attended, bringing food and good wishes. Charlotte, radiant as maid of honor in a new blue dress that matched her eyes, stood proudly beside her sister. Joe, who had appointed himself best man despite Hank's seniority, a designation Hank had readily conceded, claiming he wasn't one for fancy stand-up jobs, beamed throughout the ceremony, his eyes rarely leaving Charlotte's face. Rose wore a simple white dress ordered from a catalog and carefully altered to fit her slender figure. In her hair, she wore wildflowers gathered that morning by Charlotte, and around her neck hung the delicate gold locket Rylan had given her as an engagement present, containing a small daguerreotype of her parents that she had managed to keep through all their troubles. Rylan, handsome in a new black suit, watched Rose approach on Hank's arm with an expression of such profound love and wonder that several of the women present dabbed at their eyes. When he took Rose's hands in his voice was steady but full of emotion as he recited his vows, promising to cherish and protect her all the days of his life. "I will never let anyone separate us," he added at the end, an echo of the words that had begun their journey together. Rose's answering vows were equally heartfelt, her voice clear and strong as she pledged herself to the man who had saved not just her freedom but her heart. As Reverend Thompson pronounced them husband and wife, a cheer went up from the assembled guests. Rylan kissed his bride with a tenderness that belied his strength, and Rose knew in that moment that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night. Tables laden with food were set up under the trees. A fiddler from a neighboring ranch provided music for dancing, and even Sullivan's defeat was toasted more than once by ranchers who had suffered under his predatory practices. As the evening drew to a close, Rose found herself standing apart from the festivities for a moment, watching as Charlotte danced with Joe, her sister's laughter carrying across the yard. Rylan appeared beside her, slipping an arm around her waist. "Having regrets, Mrs. Xavier?" he asked, only half joking. Rose leaned into his embrace. "Only that my parents couldn't be here to see this. They would have loved you." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "I would have liked to know them, but I think they'd be proud of the woman you've become, Rose. I know I am." She turned in his arms to face him. "I never thought I'd find happiness again after everything that happened, but you changed that, Rylan. You gave Charlotte and me more than just freedom that day in Ash Fork. You gave us a chance at a real life." His eyes softened with emotion. "You gave me something too, Rose. Before you came, this was just land and buildings. Now it's a home." Over Rylan's shoulder, Rose saw Charlotte accept a small posy of wildflowers from Joe, blushing prettily at whatever he was saying. From the serious expression on the young man's face and Charlotte's widening eyes, Rose suspected another proposal might be forthcoming soon. "I think our family might be growing," she murmured, nodding in their direction. Rylan turned to look, a smile spreading across his face. "Good. This place was built for a family." "Speaking of family," Rose said a little shyly, "I've been thinking. I'd like to start one. Soon." The look of joy that spread across Rylan's face was all the answer she needed. He lifted her off her feet in an enthusiastic embrace, spinning her around once before setting her gently back on the ground. "Nothing would make me happier," he assured her, his voice thick with emotion. As the last of the guests departed, and the newlyweds retired to the house, the master bedroom now theirs to share, Rose found herself filled with a sense of rightness. From the darkest moment of her life on that auction platform, she had found her way to this perfect happiness. The following years brought all the joy and challenges that life on a frontier ranch entailed. Charlotte and Joe were married that autumn in a ceremony as joyous as Rose and Rylan's had been. They built a small house of their own on Xavier Ranch land, close enough for daily visits but far enough for privacy. Rose gave birth to their first child, a son they named William after Rylan's father, the following summer. Charlotte and Joe welcomed twins, a boy and a girl, a year later, filling both homes with the laughter and chaos of children. The ranch prospered under Rylan's careful management and Rose's efficient running of the household. They added more land, increased their herd, and built a larger house with plenty of room for their growing family. Hank remained with them, becoming a beloved uncle figure to the children, teaching them to ride and telling them stories of the early days of the ranch. Sullivan, true to Marshall Peterson's prediction, never troubled them again. His humiliation at Rylan's hands had diminished his standing in the territory, and within 2 years he had sold his holdings and moved east, reportedly to try his luck in the banking circles of St. Louis. On the 5th anniversary of the day Rylan had purchased the sisters' freedom, the entire extended family gathered for a celebration. As dusk fell, Rose found herself once again standing on the porch, watching as Rylan played with their 3 children. William had been joined by 2 sisters in the intervening years. Nearby, Charlotte sat on a blanket with her twins and new baby, while Joe and Hank supervised the roasting of a whole steer for the feast. "Penny for your thoughts," Charlotte said, joining Rose on the porch after handing her infant son to Joe. Rose smiled at her sister. "I was just thinking about how far we've come. Do you ever think about that day in Ash Fork?" Charlotte nodded, her expression sobering momentarily. "Sometimes. It was the worst day of my life until Rylan stepped forward. He said he wouldn't let anyone separate us," Rose recalled softly. "And he never has." "We were lucky," Charlotte agreed, linking her arm through her sister's. "But I think we've made our own luck too, don't you?" Rose nodded, watching as Rylan scooped up their youngest daughter, swinging her high in the air as she squealed with delight. His hair had a few strands of silver now, and the Arizona sun had etched fine lines around his eyes, but he was still the same steady, honorable man who had risked everything to save 2 sisters he didn't even know. "Mama, come play," William called, waving enthusiastically from where he was attempting to teach his middle sister how to lasso a fence post. "Go on," Charlotte urged with a smile. "Your family needs you." Rose squeezed her sister's hand. "Our family," she corrected gently. "All of us together, just as it should be." As she descended the porch steps to join her husband and children, Rose felt a profound gratitude for the journey that had brought her here, from desperate fear to perfect joy, from the auction block to this land that was now truly home. And at the center of it all was Rylan, the man who had kept his promise never to let them be separated, and in doing so had given them all a life richer and more beautiful than they could ever have imagined.